Hi, and welcome back to the annual seminar on glass. My name is Julie Belmar, and I'm the curator of early modern glass here at the museum. Just a reminder that you can place any questions for our speaker in the Q&A feature or the chat feature. Our technical support team is available to you. If you need any help, you can contact them at avuser@cmog.org or by using the chat feature in the seminar lobby. We will have about 5 to 10 minutes after the presentation for questions from the audience, so please have those ready. It is our great pleasure today to welcome our wonderful keynote speaker, Dr. Jessica Murphy. Dr. Murphy is a museum professional with a passion for perfume. She holds a PhD in art history and has worked at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Brooklyn Museum, where she is currently manager of group experiences. She has been writing about fragrance since 2007 and has lectured about the history and culture of scent through venues including the Institute for Art and Olfaction, the Brooklyn Brainery, the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and the Timken Museum of Art. At the Brooklyn Museum, she has created scented gallery tours on a variety of exhibition topics. Her keynote today is titled Feathers, Fur, and Fragrance, the Enduring Appeal of Animal-Shaped Perfume Bottles. Thank you and welcome, Jessica Murphy.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, thank you all for joining this session, and thanks especially to Julie Belmar and the museum for the invitation to speak today. As someone who focuses a lot on the meeting points between the visual and the olfactory, I'm really honored to be part of this unprecedented seminar that is bringing together so many scholarly considerations of the connected histories of fragrance and glass. See if I can move my first slide. I got a message that CMOG, oh no, there it is. Use buttons below or keyboard shortcuts. Okay. I'm sorry, I'm trying to use my keyboard shortcuts to go forward, but it's giving me a little trouble. Oh. Now we went forward a little bit too much. Okay. I'll try this. Thank you. Here is my first slide after the introduction slide. And I'll begin with a memory here. One of the first perfumes I ever owned when I was still very young was Avon Sweet Honesty in a bottle shaped like a skunk. According to the Avon catalog, it was named Sniffy, and it was smelling a little rose made from a ribbon. The humor of putting a perfume into a container shaped like an animal that is known for giving off a decidedly unpleasant smell was lost on me as a child. I hope Shakespeare would not be offended by my pairing a line from his tragedy King Lear with a $5 mass-produced perfume. Sweet Honesty certainly did not include any animal-derived ingredients like civet oil, but its animal-shaped vessel sparked my imagination just as much as the fragrance itself did. I also did not realize at the time that perfume containers shaped like animals have been made and cherished for thousands of years, with important examples surviving from ancient Egypt, the classical world of Greece and the Roman Empire, and the ancient Near East. Some of those forms of birds and beasts were sacred or symbolic. Others were primarily decorative, or yes, even humorous. The modern era witnessed a new proliferation of zoomorphic fragrance vessels. At the start of the 20th century, specifically, perfume houses began working with glassmakers to create specific branded bottles for individual fragrances, rather than allowing the customer to choose a bottle from a wide selection and have it filled and labeled with the perfume of their choice. Now, the bottle that protected and dispensed its volatile liquid was just one element of a cohesive visual identity that included packaging and print advertising. The bottle, in particular, needed to tempt the senses of sight and touch, even before the sense of smell, and it needed to be novel, memorable, and distinctive. Together, we'll take a close look in this presentation at a selection of commercial perfume bottles shaped like birds and beasts. They are works of design in themselves. They also share certain references and contexts with the fine arts, fashion, and visual culture. There are 5 entries in this metaphorical menagerie of scent and art. Our first example is Guerlain's Flacon Tortue, or tortoise bottle, from 1914, designed by Baccarat, the venerable glassmaker founded in France in the mid-1700s. The bottle's stopper is the turtle's head, held in place by a cord anchored to the tiny front legs and knotted on top. The tortoise bottle was presented in a red leather case, stamped with a motif of gold and green lines. The fragrance house of Guerlain is nearly 2 centuries old. It was established by Pierre-François Pascal Guerlain in Paris in 1828, with a first shop on the Rue de Rivoli. By the mid-1800s, Guerlain's clients include European and British royalty and many other aristocratic and affluent customers. A flagship on Paris's fashionable Rue de la Paix in Paris opened in 1840 and was managed by a second generation of the Guerlain family, then by a third. It was very much a Parisian brand, attuned to the culture of its hometown. At the turn of the 20th century, Paris was a center of an innovative style called Art Nouveau that was permeating the decorative arts, architecture, and visual culture. As a response to the heavy, historicized styles of previous decades, Art Nouveau felt like a breath of fresh air. It took inspiration from the natural world and frequently incorporated whiplash curves and subtle asymmetries. In Paris, it could be spotted in elegant new department stores and private townhouses, as well as the new metro stations around the city. From its earliest years, Guerlain worked with the finest glass manufacturers around Paris to create its fragrance vessels. Guerlain even released one of the first commercial perfume bottles inspired by an animal, more specifically a mollusk. This was the triangular bottle named the escargot, or snail, at left, introduced in 1902 for scents designed to be applied to handkerchiefs. With its spiral forms, the 3-sided escargot was all curves, including its stopper and the lettering of Guerlain on its shoulders, an ideal fit for the era. The bottle for Le Bleu at center isn't animal-inspired, but it's another example of a Guerlain perfume bottle that incorporated a prevalent design style. It was designed by Raymond Guerlain in collaboration with Baccarat. Its stopper in the shape of an inverted heart, the scrolls at its shoulders, the circular label with curving fonts and leaf designs, all of them fit the Art Nouveau fascination with sinuous shapes. In 1914, the world was changing, and so was Guerlain. The company was in the hands of a third generation of Guerlain perfumers and entrepreneurs, Jacques and Pierre Guerlain. The First World War began in 1914. In later decades, the pre-war years of the French Belle Époque, or beautiful era, were recalled with nostalgia for their economic prosperity, cultural optimism, and stable government. In the years leading up to the war, however, Guerlain was planning to introduce a new boutique. The primarily residential Champs-Élysées was being redeveloped as an upscale commercial center, and Guerlain was opening its new flagship location at 68 Champs-Élysées. In an interview that appeared widely as a syndicated newspaper column, Gabriel Guerlain reminded his interviewer that Guerlain had operated perfume factories on the Champs-Élysées in the 1830s, several decades before the rebuilding of Paris and the earlier development of this avenue. In this way, the establishment of a shop on the newly retail-oriented Champs-Élysées was a kind of homecoming for Guerlain. The building for this multi-story boutique was designed by the architect who had recently designed the Ritz hotels in Paris and London. Inside, it also reflected the prestige of the Guerlain brand. Contemporary newspaper reports describe the decoration of the shop, including the use of a dozen kinds of Italian marble. The company's new corporate offices were located upstairs, reached by an elegant staircase with a wrought iron banister. To commemorate the opening of this new flagship, Guerlain launched a perfume named Parfum des Champs-Élysées. It was packaged in a new bottle designed for Guerlain by Baccarat. This was the tortoise bottle. The 80 facets of the turtle's shell and head are sharply edged. The small legs are textured in a scaly pattern, and there is the cord holding the head stopper in place. I like that one of these newspaper mentions just describes it as an oddly shaped bottle, perhaps not grasping that this was intended to, in fact, be a turtle. According to present-day Guerlain sources, the Parfum des Champs-Élysées bottle was an amusing reference to the slow process of planning the new flagship boutique. The slow and steady pace of turtles has been a literary motif since Aesop's ancient fable of the tortoise and the hare, which was adapted and popularized in France by Jean de La Fontaine. The turtle overtakes the fast and furious hare due to its perseverance and focus. At a time of rapid change on the Champs-Élysées and intense competition between the major Parisian fragrance houses, this would have been an appropriate bit of humor. I'm also wondering whether the tortoise bottle owes some of its inspiration to another tradition. At the turn of the century, a taste for Japanese influence had saturated French production and consumption of luxury goods. This Baccarat bottle reminds me of some Japanese sources, for example, inro, which were small multi-compartment containers that men wore attached to their belts, first in place of pockets and later primarily as status items. They were often crafted in fine materials like lacquer decorated with metallic powders, ivory, and mother of pearl. An oval or cylindrical shape was most common, but inro in the shapes of animals, sometimes even with the netsuke or hanging bead of the shape of an animal, were also made. Is it possible that someone associated with Guerlain or Baccarat saw a turtle-shaped or tortoise-shell inro and adapted that idea for the Champs-Élysées bottle? The integration of the cord is reminiscent of inro, and turtles appear not only in inro and their netsuke beads, but in much Japanese art that was coveted by cultured Parisians. In Japanese culture, the turtle has held auspicious meaning as a symbol of support or longevity. In 1914, as the Champs-Élysées Guerlain boutique was opening, Jacques Guerlain was called up for military duty in the war. By this time, he and his brother Pierre were both married with children. Surely the Guerlain family and brand were thinking about their own future at this moment and hoping for the longevity of their fragrance house. The tortoise bottle the tortoise bottle remained in production for about 25 years. Guerlain has reissued it 3 times, most recently for the 2014 centennial and renovation of the Champs-Élysées boutique, containing a new fragrance, but still using a 100-year-old mold from the Guerlain archives. Like the boutique itself, the interior may have been updated, but its exterior maintains its original artistic design of a century ago. And here's our second example. Anyone who has been on social media over the past decade or two has seen the ways that images of cats can be used to elicit humor, project human emotions, and connect current events and popular culture. But of course, the human fascination with cats has a much longer history. This bottle, created by Baccarat for Jovoy's fragrance Gardez-moi, is very specific to its own moment of 1926 in two ways. These photos show the black crystal bottle standing on its yellow satin-colored base and then lying down so that we can see the stopper in its bottom. In its relatively short existence, the House of Jovoy was known for its animal perfume presentations. In the 1920s, Jovoy also released perfumes in bottles shaped like a Dalmatian puppy, a parrot, and a camel. However, Gardez-moi was the most exclusive, and very few examples survive. On one hand, or paw, Jovoy's Gardez-moi is a perfect specimen of commercial packaging in an Art Deco vein. Art Deco was an international decorative style, highly popular in the 1920s and 1930s, and known initially as le style moderne, the modern style, or jazz moderne. Art Deco is thought to have developed first in France, and it attracted much wider notice through the International Exhibition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts, held in Paris in 1925. The term Art Deco was assigned to this style in the 1960s. It now refers to objects like these, created between the world wars, characterized by an avant-garde simplification, and often incorporating geometrical motifs, as well as abstracted natural forms, references to the arts of Asia and Africa, and a combination of fine materials and new production techniques. When human figures, flowers, and foliage and animals appeared in Art Deco objects, they were stylishly attenuated, flattened, often rendered in lacquer or enamel, or surrounded by other shiny materials. Cats seem to be very popular animals in Art Deco, perhaps for their natural sleekness and their sophisticated attitude of self-sufficiency. Here are works by two artists, or rather three artists, who were known particularly for their animal sculptures in the 1920s and 1930s. When the Swiss-born artist Marcel Edouard Sandoz depicted a cat, he chose to show it seated on its hind legs, which makes it vertical yet compact and works well for viewing the piece in the round. Jan Martel and Joël Martel, twin brothers who operated a studio in Paris, also preferred the tall seated pose, with the front paws placed close together when they sculpted cats. The Martels wrote about the abstract lines and forms of their subjects being of primary concern, with literal anatomy as a secondary priority. They acknowledged the influence of ancient Roman, Cambodian, and Egyptian sculpture on their own solid, simplified compositions. This brings us to the second layer of influence on Jovoy's Gardez-moi cat, the Egyptomania of the 1920s. There had been earlier moments of Western fascination with the history and artifacts of ancient Egypt, but this one was particularly intense and fueled by mass media. It followed the 1922 discovery of the tomb of King Tutankhamun by a team of Egyptian workers led by the archaeologist Howard Carter and financed by the English Lord Carnarvon. The open tomb, located in the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile River, revealed 4 chambers filled with priceless objects, from chariots and furniture to jewelry, fine vessels, and the king's gold burial mask. The documenting of the tomb unfolded over 10 years, during which time Egyptomania spread throughout the visual culture of Europe and the United States. Photographs of the tomb site were obsessively collected, and people enjoyed a taste of this faraway event through the obelisks, pyramids, sphinxes, scarabs, and hieroglyphs that popped up in art, popular culture, advertising, architecture, and consumer goods in the 1920s. Egyptian-themed illustrations, often filtered through Art Deco, were used to promote everything from fashion to sheet music to hotels. Here's a trade card for the Luxor Hotel at upper right, a brochure for motor oil at the lower right, and a perfume bottle shaped like an obelisk at the lower left. I've brought this hotel card back because it includes two slinky black cats, and cats in ancient Egyptian tomb paintings and sculptures influenced fine artists and industrial designers alike in the 1920s. We just saw works by the Martel brothers and Sandoz, and here are the kinds of ancient Egyptian cat sculptures that would have influenced those sculptors, as well as perhaps Baccarat's bottle designers. The ancient Egyptians drew close connections between felines and deities in their visual arts and manuscripts. Certain gods were portrayed in feline form, since cats were believed to share essential characteristics with those deities. For example, they were thought to embody a similar ferocity and warmth as the sun god Ra. Egyptians depicted cats and cat-headed gods in various poses, including this position. Some surviving Egyptian cat figures are solid statuettes of bronze or wood. Others were created as wooden coffins for mummified cats that would be placed in human tombs as offerings. The cat at the right is a hollow alabaster container that originally had a stone stopper fitted into the top of its head. It held something very precious, a perfumed oil. They all share an interesting detail. As curator Yekaterina Barbash of the Brooklyn Museum has noted, because the dominant orientation of Egyptian hieroglyphs requires images of humans and animals to face right, cats' tails are always depicted on the cat's right side in both 2- and 3-dimensional images. Jovoy and Baccarat have incorporated this feature in Garde-Moi. The name of this perfume, Garde-Moi, is translated as keep me, and is often understood as the feline's command to its owner, keep me close, or keep me secure, as a prized possession that's also a wild creature, or a love-related request, garde-moi, like be mine. Could it also be the words of the human owner of the perfume, asking this elegant cat for protection, guard me, keep me safe? Accompanied by this powerful creature, she would feel like a goddess in her own time, and a good-smelling one at that. And here we have a Lalique bottle, which Veronique has introduced us to, as well as the entire history of Lalique in her wonderful talk a little earlier today. Here we have a quote from Nina Ricci, a fashion designer and entrepreneur with a poetic vision. The creation of a perfume is an act of love, whether real or imaginary. I am a romantic. I couldn't imagine living without dreams. Ricci was born Maria Nielli in Turin, Italy. Her family moved to France when she was a child. She was a talented self-taught seamstress, and she opened her own couture house in 1932, offering custom-made fashion for the upper middle classes. Her son Roberto decided that if the country was to grow and to establish international sales, Nina Ricci needed a fragrance line. In 1941, his mother made him a co-owner of the business. Courgeois, the first Ricci fragrance, was launched in 1946 with a crystal heart-shaped bottle created by Lalique at the right. Its success was nearly eclipsed by the arrival of L'air du Temps in 1948. This fragrance is a soft floral bouquet of creamy gardenia and spicy carnation with a classical rose and jasmine heart. Its name translates loosely as the spirit of its time, or as fragrance historian Elizabeth de Feydeau has written, the air that we breathe, the mood of the moment, the desire to live fully each moment of life. In 1848, France was still recuperating after many losses of life and the long economic and social devastation wrought by the Second World War. A longing for harmony and joy was evident in much of the fashion and fragrance of the later 1940s, including this original bottle for L'air du Temps. Roberto Ricci commissioned this bottle from the artist Juan Rebull. Rebol had recently created a sculpture of Ricci's daughter with a dove on her shoulder. The box carried an illustration inspired by that sculpture. The bottle was circular, with a sunburst design and a small dove on the cap. The sun, the bird, and the young girl. All three motifs communicated a fresh start and a sense of optimism. Doves are ancient and global symbols. In the Old Testament book of Genesis, after Noah and his family survived the great flood in their ark, Noah sends out a dove to search for solid ground. In ancient Mesopotamia, doves were prominent animal symbols of Inanna Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. In classical antiquity, doves were associated with the Greek goddess of love, Aphrodite, who was sometimes depicted with doves. Here we see one on her knee. This avian symbolism of a return to security, peace, and romance would have resonated strongly with a post-war audience. The famous bottle still used for L'air du Temps was designed by Marc Lalique and released 3 years later. The Corning Museum owns a large-scale example, which really made an impression on me when I first saw it on a visit to the museum. Here is one of my own snapshots on the right, as well as an official collection photo, and a portrait of Roberto Ricci himself holding one of the bottles at center. The iconic L'air du Temps bottle is elegantly curved, with twisted fluting that brings the eye upward from its delicate foot up past its convex body to its small neck. The stopper takes the dove motif into 3 dimensions and doubles it. The 2 birds are touching their beaks together, almost merging into a single creature. They have a frosted satin matte surface that contrasts with the transparency of the bottle's body. Looking through American magazines and newspapers from these years, I found that L'air du Temps was for sale in the United States from 1948 onwards, although the new dove style didn't seem to cross the Atlantic until 1953. When it did so in style. It made its debut in the States as a luxury presentation of a small bird cage lined with yellow satin to showcase the bottle of perfume inside. The bird cage was even illuminated with a small electric light to make a literally radiant impression on a dressing table or vanity. The 2-dove bottle could also be purchased as a freestanding item, and it was praised in promotional copy for its romance, its glamour, its femininity. The same words were often used to describe Nina Ricci's fashion for women in the late 1940s and 50s. This era was defined by the style known as the New Look, as it was nicknamed by Harper's Bazaar editor Carmel Snow when she saw Christian Dior's newest collection in 1947. As a practitioner of the New Look, Ricci dressed women in full skirts, padded shoulders and hips, and nipped waists. She incorporated historically redolent references like bustles and paired her garments with large hats. The pendulum had swung from the boxy, functional clothing of the wartime years, made under strict rationing of materials, to this generous use of fabric and trimmings. In this way, designers like Dior and Ricci helped revive the production of fine textiles in France, while inspiring women to infuse their wardrobes with romance and fantasy again. If some of these elements looked like throwbacks to the turn of the century, that was a deliberate effect. This approach to women's fashion and fragrance looked back in order to look forward through the extravagant shaping and draping of New Look silhouettes and perfume packaging. The L'air du Temps bottle even seems to echo the shapes of some of Ricci's clothing designs, small at the waist, curved at the hip, balanced on a graceful foot, and topped with birds like the taxidermied species that had ornamented women's hats at the turn of the century and were back, although on a smaller scale, with the New Look. The 1950s ushered in an era of economic prosperity after the World War, especially in the United States, which hadn't been a battleground in the military conflict. Marriage rates rose as soldiers returned from service, resulting in the baby boom, and traditional gender roles and the ideal of the nuclear family were reinforced by popular culture and Cold War governmental messaging. This was a decade of relative stability, increased consumerism, and for many women, a return to the domestic sphere and conventional social roles after temporarily joining military service or the workforce. Thinking back to that luxury presentation of L'air du Temps, did this moment ever feel like a gilded cage for some of them? However, we will end this section on a positive note. Late 20th century ads for L'air du Temps often referred to the bottle in their copy as well as imagery. The ad on the left, dating to the 1960s, features a picture of two doves in a similar pose, amplifying the dreamy mood of the bottle. An advertisement from the early 1970s on the right showed a new version with a single dove on the stopper. Its caption is gently ironic. The perfume that made the bottle famous, reminding us that the actual fragrance was just as established and beloved as its iconic container. As Roberto Ricci said, if perfume is an art, the object that contains it must be a masterpiece, the masterpiece of a craftsman. In the late 1970s and early 80s, the perfume market expanded to welcome a flood of perfumes licensed by a new generation of fashion designers. Ralph Lauren, Halston, Calvin Klein, Diane von Furstenberg, and many others. For several decades, fragrance had been perceived as an affordable point of access to high fashion. Now, as more fashion designers became household names, and entertainment celebrities like Sophia Loren and Elizabeth Taylor started to seek perfume licensing deals, fragrance was also a means of feeling an emotional connection to a famous person and their work. One unusual release of 1982 was a collaboration between a cosmetics brand and a woman who was not an actor or designer. She was an avant-garde French-American visual artist named Niki de Saint-Phalle. Her perfume, bearing her own name, was packaged in a bottle topped with two snakes. De Phalle was not as famous as someone like Calvin Klein or Elizabeth Taylor, but she was a well-known artist whose deceptively whimsical-looking art often attracted controversy. She was born in France to a French father and an American mother, and was educated in the United States. She worked briefly as a fashion model before moving back to Europe with her first husband in the early 1950s. De Phalle was self-taught as an artist, and by the early 1960s, she was collaborating with artists like Yves Klein, Jasper Johns, Robert Rauschenberg, and Yves Tinguely, who was her second husband. She became known for her vibrant, playful imagery of animals, humans, and celestial beings in many media formats and scales. Her curvy Nana figures, and we see one at the left, were larger-than-life sculptural expressions of female sexuality and feminist independence. She later said, "I thought beforehand that to be provocative, you had to attack religion or generals. I realized that there was nothing more shocking than joy." De Phalle's dream project was a sculptural site to be named the Tarot Garden. It would be built in Tuscany and would include large-scale sculptures inspired by cards of the tarot deck. The cost of designing and building such a site was exorbitant, and she intended her fragrance venture to help finance it. De Phalle said in 1981, "I decided to become my own patron, financing some much-loved projects by entering an industry I'd never worked in before." For her namesake fragrance, the artist worked with Jacqueline Cochran Incorporated. Cochran was an American manufacturer and distributor of cosmetics and perfume, and at the time it held the licenses for brands like Nina Ricci, Pierre Cardin, and Jeffrey Bean. The perfumer behind Niki de Saint-Phalle was uncredited, but the scent was produced under the auspices of Norda Essential Oil and Chemical Company, a flavor and fragrance business. It included fruity notes of marigold and peach, florals of tuberose and jasmine, and a woody base of vetiver and oak moss, and dominating the composition, a sharp green note of galbanum. However, the bottle came first. Niki de Saint-Phalle sketched a design that would be manufactured by the 300-year-old French glassmaker Saint-Gobain de Joncaire. She conceived of it as a small work of art. She said, "I thought, wouldn't it be nice to do a mass sculpture, something that millions of people will buy and enjoy on a daily basis?" For the body of the bottle, de Saint-Phalle chose a rich cobalt blue shade. She said it was inspired by an antique Guerlain bottle that she had seen. She didn't specify which one, but we might imagine that it could have been one of these two, both from the 1930s. The artist was already using a similar shade of blue in her art and would use it even more frequently for the 1980s onwards. For the cap of her bottle, the artist designed a pair of entwined snakes. She had used snake imagery in her art before, so it was already part of her artistic vocabulary of joy and eros. She said, "I chose serpents because I liked all the contradictory meanings they represent: sensuality, temptation, treachery." Snakes appear in mythology across time and place. One famous example, of course, is the serpent in the Garden of Eden, an ancient symbol of deception and a fall from grace. Yet de Saint-Phalle stressed that snakes have also been associated, in other texts and legends, with fertility, renewal, and healing, so it's a complex symbol. There are a few examples of snake bottles before Niki de Saint-Phalle, and the most illustrious one might be one created by Lalique, circa 1920 at Wright. Glass molded and finished to depict a scaly snake. The head is the bottle's stopper. Here is another version with the snake parts produced in silver. Both snakes are threatening, with their mouths open and their fangs bared to strike. De Phalle's serpents, on the other hand, are polychromatic and playful and engaged with one another. The male snake is electroplated gold, and the female snake is hand-painted in 5 colors. We know which is which because the artist said, "I made the female snake colorful and the male snake gold because I wanted to reverse nature. I've always been annoyed that nature makes some male animals more colorful than females, and this was my chance to change that." The release of Niki de Saint-Phalle's Perfume received extensive coverage in trade publications and in the mainstream beauty press, especially because the launch parties were true spectacles. The artist wore a special outfit topped with a double serpent hat, inspired by the bottle and designed for her by Marc Bohan at Christian Dior. They had known each other since her days as a fashion model. The New York launch party at a French restaurant in Midtown Manhattan was co-hosted by Andy Warhol. Snake handlers appeared with live pythons. Fashion designers and socialites admired the works of art by de Saint-Phalle that had been installed in the restaurant, and someone stole 2 giant display models of the double snake perfume bottle. Niki de Saint-Phalle, the fragrance, entered the market in various sizes and concentrations. The lowest price point was $16 for travel size eau de toilette. The highest was $160 for 1 ounce of pure Perfume in the 2 snake bottle. Press coverage of the launch mentioned de Phalle's wish to extend the boundaries of art and frequently called the bottle a serpent sculpture. Niki de Phalle had spoken of her wish that customers would repurpose the bottles once they'd used up the perfume. She envisioned women putting the double snake bottle on a mantelpiece as a decorative object, or using the circular blue eau de toilette splash bottles as small flower vases after the perfume was gone. The lavish launch parties and extensive promotional tours were typical of the 1980s across an affluent sector of society and culture. It was a decade marked by a booming economy and art market, unabashed consumerism, and optimistic popular culture. However, there was a darker side to some aspects of life in the 1980s. Some advertisements for Niki de Saint-Phalle included the tagline, "Dangerous, but worth the risk." In retrospect, this meshing of erotic attraction with menace is hard to read without thinking of the lethal HIV/AIDS virus that was spreading so rapidly during these same years. Niki de Saint-Phalle herself was certainly aware of this global health crisis. She dedicated much of her own art of the 1980s to raising awareness of HIV/AIDS and safe sex practices for prevention of the virus. Her book, AIDS, You Can't Catch It Holding Hands, with its vibrant illustrations and its calls for education and compassion, was published in several languages and distributed free in French schools. Ambiguous-looking snakes, maybe playful, maybe perilous, also appeared in some of her HIV/AIDS-related work, like this poster on the right. Meanwhile, Jacqueline Cochran Incorporated saw strong sales for Niki de Saint-Phalle's perfume and related products, a scented soap, a scented dusting powder, a necklace in shape of the two entwined snakes, and more. A timeless symbol like the snake never really loses its appeal. There have been other snake perfume bottles in recent years. They may touch on ideas of seduction and temptation, but by comparison, they feel somehow superficial, lacking the artistic intentions and social context of Niki de Saint-Phalle's sinuous creatures in their risky embrace. Our fifth and last example is the bottle for Anna Sui's Sui Love, launched in 2002. It is a stylized glass butterfly shaded in hot pink, yellow, and orange, with flower motifs in place of eye spots at the ends of its wings. The metallic cap is also part of the design. The small spirals at the top edges signify the tips of the butterfly's antennae. Butterflies share certain qualities with perfume. They develop in stages, morphing from one state to the next. When they are released from their cocoon or bottle, they initially cling tightly, then take flight into the air. They are difficult to capture and contain. They are fragile and ephemeral, but give us sensory pleasure during their short existences. Looking back even a century ago, a butterfly motif might be incorporated into a fragrance bottle in various ways. It could be the shape of a printed label or a design on packaging like a box. It could be depicted directly on the surface, like these hand-painted butterflies on a bottle in the Corning Museum's collections. It could be etched into the glass, like this example by Lalique for De Vigny, which also has a textured butterfly-shaped stopper. Or the butterfly itself, the bottle itself could be shaped like a butterfly. Here are some images of Anna Sui promoting the launch of Sui Love, posing with an oversized display bottle and holding one of the actual eau de toilette bottles for scale. Sui has often spoken of her commitment to an overall look that has extended from her own apartment to her showroom and boutiques, from her personal collections to her brand's visual identity, from her clothing designs to all licensed products. For Sui Love, Anna recalls, she made a sketch that she shared with the designers working on the bottle. She would have gone back and forth with them as they adapted her concept to fit the available production technology. The butterfly is an emblem that has fluttered throughout her work, from the founding of her brand in 1980 and her first runway show in 1991 to the present. And this end result encapsulated two of her favorite inspirations within one signature motif. As this Love Sui Love article from Women's Wear Daily noted, Sui Love and its presentation were inspired by the 60s. Although Swee's designs often sample and fuse ideas from various historical eras and artistic movements, she has said that, quote, "The 1960s was the period that really shaped me and my love for fashion. It will always represent a time of ultimate optimism, revolution, freedom, and infinite possibility, a youth quake. Everything was changing. Music, film, design, art. The new guard was taking over." The 1960s popularized graphic symbols like the peace sign, the daisy, and the butterfly. It migrated from the mod and hippie movements into the mainstream. Here are two examples of the way it became visual shorthand for a new generation. Even the wholesome daughters of television's The Brady Bunch adopted this symbol of liberation and transformation. A butterfly showed up in their bedroom in the form of a trippy black light poster, a hint of the counterculture beyond their suburban enclave. I recently had an opportunity to ask Anna about her own use of butterflies, and she mentioned the 1968 movie I Love You, Alice B. Toklas. In this film, Peter Sellers, as a 30-something lawyer, falls for a free spirit played by Lee Taylor Young and is fascinated by, among other attributes, the butterfly tattoo on her thigh. That detail is echoed in Anna Swee's Fall-Winter 1992 runway show with the temporary tattoo that appeared on supermodel Naomi Campbell's almost bare bottom. This was one of the first butterflies to appear in Swee's runway presentations and ready-to-wear collections, but not the last. Just a season or two later, butterflies surfaced as decoupage elements on a handbag and as colorful appliques on a pair of pants. Swee said in 2012, "People come to me for butterflies. From the season I did the butterfly faux tattoos on the models on the runway, every collection we do has to have a butterfly t-shirt or trim or print." She has offered gauzy butterfly wings, recently reissued, scattered small butterflies on models' legs in another possible echo of Alice B. Toklas, and worked them into oversized patterns on dresses. If pressed to pinpoint the moment when her use of the butterfly element really solidified, the designer might name two developments in her career. One was the decoration of her first boutique in Manhattan's Soho neighborhood in 1992. It was furnished in a very particular visual vocabulary: papier-mâché mannequin heads, vintage furniture painted shiny black, carved roses, and butterflies. You can spot one high on the purple wall at the upper right. The second development was her business's expansion into licensed Anna Sui products, where signature motifs like butterflies were worked into jewelry, home decor, cosmetics cases, luggage, and yes, perfume bottles. Walking into this boutique in New York City, you would have also spotted some very colorful rock posters on the wall, another link to Swee's personal collections and cultural passions. Her love for psychedelic posters from the 1960s and 70s dates back to her teenage years, when she would attend concerts in her native Detroit, and their graphic style, their use of line and color and imagery, has influenced her own work. More than a few rock posters of the 60s and 70s included butterflies as symbols of freedom and sensuality and change. I think we can see how their vivid, sometimes acidic colors and swooping shapes, and even their stylized lettering, have found their way into the visual identity for Sweet Love. The psychedelic 60s is one cultural reference point encapsulated in the Sweet Love butterfly bottle. And there's a second nested within the first. Anna says, "I've always been attracted to butterflies because they're very Art Nouveau, the shape, and you can really play with that shape." Butterflies lent themselves well to Art Nouveau design over a century ago, with their curves and their filigree patterns, their flatness, their translucence, and a silhouette that can be adapted to a myriad of materials and formats. In the early 1890s and 1900s, Art Nouveau was a rarefied rejection of the Industrial Revolution and the rapid growth of urban centers. A half-century later, it was due for a revival. Its imaginative visual language appealed to the counterculture of the 1960s, to a generation that was challenging expectations about authority, equality, and conventional gender roles. That popularity of the butterfly in Western turn-of-the-century design was also a product of cultural exchange and scientific discovery. After Japan opened up to international trade in the 1850s, after a long period of commercial isolation, Japanese art, including its depictions of flora and fauna, caught the attention of European artists and designers. The late 1800s was also an era when literal butterfly collecting became popular as an accessible form of scientific education boosted by newly affordable equipment for amateurs. The biologist Ernest Haeckel published Art Forms in Nature, a portfolio of drawings that bridged science and art and inspired designers of all kinds to look closely at the natural world, including winged insects. Source books like The Animal in Decoration and Ornamental Combinations went a step further. They provided artistic adaptations of plants and animal forms and showed how these designs could be applied to the decorative arts. One result was a wave of glass butterfly bottles rippling through the 1910s and 1920s. Butterflies, they are very Art Nouveau. They are very 1960s. They are the summer of love, and they are effervescent flapper girls emerging at the end of the First World War. They are the dancer Loie Fuller swirling under electric lights at the turn of the 20th century, and they are a hippie hypnotizing the older generation with her tattoo during the Woodstock era. They are delicate and brilliant and endlessly variable, a perfect starting point for a perfume bottle. And so we have come full circle back to the early 1900s. We have looked at glass interpretations of a reptile, a feline, a pair of birds, a pair of snakes, so more reptiles, and an insect from different decades. They were all variously influenced by historical art and contemporary art, by myth and symbolism, with connections to fashion and cultural revivals and current events. Whether Avon or Baccarat, or something in between, a familiar or fantastical creature can introduce us to the story of a scent. Even before we open animal-shaped containers to enjoy an olfactory experience, they sweeten our imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I can barely digest everything that you've shown us today. It was so beautiful and so well put together. Thank you. On a personal note, I still can't believe that you discussed Niki Snefal at length like this. This is the perfume that my mom wears and has been wearing since the 80s. And I can confirm that the bottles are used as decoration still.
She would
So
be so glad to know that, I think. Yeah, she passed away sooner than she should have, but I bet she would be very happy to know that.
yeah, and I echo Troy's comment in the chat, Troy Smythe, who said that he was really glad that these bottles were being discussed in the context of the AIDS epidemic, and that double symbolism of the snake I thought was really insightful. We already have a few questions coming in. One that was during your talk, about the cat bottle by Javoy, how does the stopper on the bottom of the Gardez-moi perfume bottle stay secured and not leak?
That is a wonderful question. And, of these bottles I discussed, I think that is the only one where I haven't been able to see one in person. I don't think very many were made. I think I know of three that exist. And I'm grateful to Ken Leach for allowing me to share his photos of his example because I haven't encountered one in person yet. Of the three or of the four different animal bottles produced by Jovoy, this was the one that seemed to come and go. The others stuck around longer, the little parrot in the cage, the puppy dog, the camel. They were around a while. I I can't help wondering if there were production challenges with this bottle, if this is one reason that it seemed to disappear as soon as it made its debut, because it's very hard even to find like mentions in any newspapers of this, let alone ads. I don't know. I mean, it looks like there was the thread. It looks like there was the traditional technique of sort of that little gilt thread tying the stopper shut. But once you had opened that, I I am not sure how physically it would not leak if you stood it vertically. But if any of you have ever had the good fortune to get your hands on one of these bottles and have a more informed idea, I would also love to hear that. It's a very elusive example.
Thank you. We have another question. Sorry, Angie is asking, as I look at my own collection of fragrances, the only contemporary bottle that uses an animal form is Grace Coddington's cat bottle or cap. Are there any recently, there you go, are there any recently produced fragrances in animal-inspired bottles, such as Suez, that you particularly admire?
That is a great point. And I did bring my Grace Coddington just in case I thought someone asks, are there any recent examples? I brought her along. This is a collaboration between the creative director, editor, Grace Coddington, and Comme des Garçons. You know, bottles in general, I think I don't see as much variety as I know I, as a consumer, would love to see, but I think there are a lot of economic reasons for that. Like the cost of a custom bottle is so prohibitive that brands are more likely to play with imagery on the label and then use stock
Mm.
bottles or a very simple custom bottle that then they can use for different scents and employ different labels. I'm seeing a lot of fun animal shaped caps. Penhaligon's, a very old English brand, has a whole zoo or circus or, tree of animals at this point. The bottles are all the same. The heads are many, many different creatures. And I think those have done very well for Penhaligon's. Christian Louboutin, the shoe designer, has a line of fragrances with fun caps, and a few of those are animals, though not all of them. Yes, the Penhaligon's Portraits collection. There happens to be a smaller brand I love called Zoologist, where each perfume is inspired by a different animal, by a different species, but the art there is on the label, not the shape of the bottle itself. And I was happy I could include a bottle by Anna Sui because she has had a lot of fun figural bottles. There's one with a peacock. There's one, and then it's flanker that have like a filigree gilt butterfly on top. She's had a fairy. I brought my um, butterfly to show. But for the large part, I think because of the question of economics and things being produced in such large numbers and being shipped so widely, we're not really seeing delicate or unusual shapes the way people may have 100 years ago.
Yeah, we had a Connected by Glass lecture just a few weeks ago by a talk between John DiNapoli, who's a commercial perfume bottle designer, and Chandler Burr. And John was talking about how most of his stoppers are not really made of glass; they're made of plastic or some other material that's just a little bit easier to shape and mass produce. So maybe that's what's happening there. There's some, cost savings in the putting the animal or the complex shape on the stopper rather than the bottle.
I would
And
think that's I brought my cheapy L'air du Temps, and
oh,
the doves are plastic on the lower priced bottles.
oh, well, there you go.
The real deal, but it looks pretty, but then when you touch it, that's the more as Veronique talked about earlier with Lalique, it's a luxury that not everyone, but many people can afford, but the plastic is still much more reachable than the glass version.
Yeah. in so in that connected to that, Troy is asking about the cap of the Nikit Snefal bottle because it's so intricate and as you said, it's hand painted. So how could it have been sold at such an affordable price?
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed the very first part.
Yeah, no, the cap of the Niki de Saint-Phalle bottle, as you said, is hand painted. So he wonders how it could have been sold at a relatively affordable price. And do you see other examples of such caps?
I've wondered that too, and I double checked, the original press release and articles did say hand painted. I don't have actual eyes on that process in 1981, 82. It was $160 for that bottle. I'm trying to think what that would be. I'd have to convert it from 1982 to now. So
Hmm.
it was pricey. I think more customers were going to opt for the eau de toilette bottle, which I apologize. I meant to include a better picture. It was a circular cobalt blue bottle with the two snakes, not hand painted on the front, just, applied as an image. I think that was the one that many, many more people owned, and that's very easy to find on eBay or Etsy. Yeah, I don't know how they managed to make that work. I wish it had been in production even longer than it was. I have to figure out at which point it was no longer being made, but I'm guessing the economics of producing that bottle, you know, probably made it less easy to find after a while. Yeah, I think in that time it was a little spendy.
Mm. Yeah, you have to account for inflation. Uh, we have another question by Dorothy Abram. Do you know why Lanvin's My Sin perfume shows a mother and child on its front, but its ads feature a black cat?
Oh, that is such a great reference. Yeah, I knew a lot about that at one moment. I talked about it on a podcast for the Institute for Art and Olfaction because we were talking about cats and perfume, and I talked about Lanvin and My Sin. Yeah, the image of the mother and the child both wearing sort of matching pointy hats and a robe-like garment. That is the Lanvin image across the couture line, other fashion items, all the cosmetics and perfumes for the Lanvin brand. It was meant to represent the designer Jeanne, female, Jean Lanvin and her child. And I think it had been drawn by the artist Paul Eribe. I'd have to check that. So that's the Lanvin brand image. The cat shows up in the My Sin ads a lot in the 1960s specifically, and it has this sort of tagline about being naughty or being mischievous. So I think the perfume had been around for a generation by that point. I think they were trying to entice a new generation in the 60s when perfume was a little bit of a hard sell to younger folks. So they had to play on the idea that there was something a little mischievous about My Sin and play on the naughtiness of the name. And they put black cat specifically into the ads for it at that point, but only for that product.
Hmm, that makes sense. Another question. Do you know of any examples of animalic bottle forms echoing animalic scents in the perfume?
Ooh, I can't think of any offhand. And I know the topic of animalic ingredients has come up a couple times over the past day or two, that they're not something we don't encounter actual animalic ingredients very much in perfume anymore, that even 100 years ago, there were ways to imitate those with synthesized ingredients. I can't think of any. Zoologist, which I mentioned, has done some animalic scents. They're, funkier, skankier, dirtier, but the label is what has the animal imagery. I'm wondering whether there might have been such things in the ancient world, but unfortunately,
Mm,
it's not my field. I'd love to talk to someone who specializes in the classical world with that question. They could,
yeah, I'm struggling to think of perfume bottles in the shape of musk deer or sperm whales or civet cats personally. But that's an interesting thing to think about. That further about, that relationship between the content and the form and how those are in synergy or not.
exactly how literal is that containing of those ingredients? Sperm whale bottle, yes, coming now, a sperm whale excreting a little bit of ambergris. Oh, yeah, and the Dolly Parton bottle, I didn't know that John Di Napoli had designed that, has a butterfly cap on it. And well, that would have been a fantastic example to include too. So many good ones.
Um,
Yeah.
okay, we're slightly over time, but it's been wonderful discussing this with you, Jessica. Thank you so much again for your presentation. And thanks for everyone for joining us. So we will take a 10-minute break, after which we will reconvene in the next session, which explores contemporary art attitudes towards scent and glass in and olfactory art in contemporary installation practices. So please join us for that. We will take a short break and reconvene at 2:45 Eastern Time. So thank you again.